Little girl saw a German shepherd standing in heavy fog. What happened next left everyone in tears. Think you've seen kindness? Think again. What happens when a child, with nothing but pure heart, saves a life in the most incredible way? You'll be shocked, touched, and inspired. Trust me, this is a story you won't forget. Like, share, and subscribe. This one's for the ages. The fog was so thick that morning, it seemed to swallow the little town whole. Late autumn had wrapped the countryside in a damp, silver veil, muting every sound, softening every edge. Sophie's small hand was warm in her mother's as they walked along the narrow country road toward the school bus stop, their breaths curling in tiny clouds against the cold. The road ahead was barely visible, just a few ghostly meters before it faded into swirling gray. Somewhere, a distant crow called once, its voice muffled and strange in the fog. Sophie pulled her knitted scarf closer to her chin, her boots crunching softly over the frost-kissed gravel. Every step made a faint, satisfying crunch, but beyond that, the world felt still, almost too still. Even the wind seemed hesitant, barely brushing through the skeletal branches above. Then, through that shifting wall of gray, something began to take shape. At first, it was just a dark outline, tall, unmoving, like a shadow that had stepped out of place. Sophie slowed, her grip on her mother's hand tightening. As the figure emerged, the details came into focus. A large German shepherd, its thick coat glistening faintly with droplets of fog, standing perfectly still in the middle of the road. His eyes, deep amber pools, were locked on them, unblinking, steady. The dog's breath puffed into the cold in slow, deliberate clouds, each exhale curling and vanishing into the mist. Sophie could hear it now, the faint, rhythmic sound of his breathing, the almost imperceptible shift of his paws against the damp ground. There was no growl, no bark, no sign of threat, only watchfulness. Her mother's steps faltered, eyes narrowing in cautious curiosity. Sophie, though, felt something different, not fear, but a strange pull, as if the fog had revealed a secret meant just for her. The dog didn't move closer, didn't step away. He simply stood there, like a sentinel carved from the mist itself. Sophie blinked, and in that moment she caught the smallest flicker in his gaze, not menace, but something softer, something sad. It was the kind of sadness that didn't shout but lingered quietly, heavy and unspoken. She didn't know why, but she felt it deep in her small chest, a little ache she couldn't name. Behind them, the sound of the approaching school bus rumbled faintly, still hidden somewhere in the fog. But Sophie's eyes never left the dog, and his never left hers. She didn't know it yet, but the reason this mysterious dog stood waiting in the fog would soon break and mend hearts all at once. The fog still hung heavy over the little rural town, wrapping every street and garden in a pale, shifting veil. On mornings like this, everything moved slower. Footsteps were muffled, distant voices turned to whispers, and the only colors that seemed to break through were the faint yellow glow of porch lights and the deep autumn tones of leaves clinging stubbornly to the trees. Sophie had always loved her town in the fall. She was only 6, but she'd already memorized the way the air changed this time of year, cooler, sharper, carrying with it the faint, comforting smell of wood smoke from chimneys and the damp earth after a night of frost. She lived in a small, white clapboard house at the edge of town, with her mother, a patient and soft-spoken woman who taught at the elementary school, and her father, a skilled woodworker whose hands always smelled faintly of pine and varnish. Their street wasn't long, just a quiet lane lined with houses that all seemed to know each other, the kind of place where people waved from their driveways and traded garden vegetables in the summer. Sophie's world was filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Henderson from the bakery, who always slipped her an extra cookie, Mr. Wallace the postman, who knew exactly where every stray cat liked to nap, and the Bennett twins who rode their bikes up and down the lane so often that the gravel road bore faint lines from their tires. It was the kind of town where news traveled faster than the wind, carried in cheerful gossip across back fences and over steaming mugs of coffee. For weeks now, the neighbors had been talking about something, or rather, someone that had caught their attention. A German shepherd, big, with a strong build and a coat that gleamed even under the gray skies. No one knew where he had come from. He didn't seem to belong to anyone, though he was far too well-fed and cared for to be truly feral. He wasn't aggressive, but there was a stillness about him, a watchfulness in the way he moved. He appeared most often in the early mornings, as though drawn out by the first light, padding silently down the misty roads before slipping away toward the edge of the fields. Those who had seen him said he never barked, never approached, just stood quietly as if waiting. Sophie had heard the stories from her mother while they folded laundry one evening. Mrs. Callahan saw him again yesterday by the old mill road. Her mother had said, just standing there, staring down the lane. By the time she looked up from her shopping bags, he was gone. Sophie had tilted her head, curious. Was he lost? She asked. Her mother had hesitated, then smiled gently. Maybe, or maybe he's looking for someone. That last part had stuck in Sophie's mind like a burr. Looking for someone. She thought about it while she colored pictures at the kitchen table, while she fed their neighbor's chickens one Saturday, and especially when she caught sight of a large paw print once, pressed deep into the soft mud near their driveway. Life in town carried on in its usual rhythm, the small general store opening at 8, the cafe filling with regulars by past, and the school bell ringing promptly at 9. Children trudged along the roadside with backpacks that seemed too big for them, waving to friends through the mist. Sophie loved walking to the bus stop with her mother. It gave her a chance to look for mysteries, as she called them, anything unusual or worth wondering about. A bird's nest tucked into a mailbox. An abandoned bicycle leaning against a tree. The faint sound of rushing water from somewhere she couldn't see. Her mother always kept a close eye on her explorations. Sophie was endlessly curious, and though their little town was safe, she had a habit of drifting toward anything that caught her attention. She also had a deep love for animals, one that her parents had nurtured from the moment she could toddle toward the family cat. Dogs, in particular, fascinated her. She could list the names of every single dog she had ever met in town, from Max, the golden retriever who belonged to the librarian, to Tilly, the tiny terrier who barked from the window of the hardware store whenever anyone walked by. And then, there was this mysterious German shepherd. Sophie had not yet seen him with her own eyes, but she imagined him often. In her mind, he was taller than she was, with ears that twitched at every sound and eyes that saw everything. She imagined him waiting for someone important, someone he loved. She wondered if maybe that someone had gotten lost in the fog. The whispers about the dog grew with each passing day. Some neighbors thought he might have belonged to a farmer from the next county over, someone who had moved away and left him behind. Others swore they had seen him sitting by the old bus depot in the early hours, as if expecting someone to step off a bus that never came. The stories varied, but one thing was always the same. No one had managed to get close enough to touch him. It was as though he lived half in their world, half in some quiet place of his own. That morning, as Sophie and her mother prepared to leave for the bus stop, the fog lay thicker than she'd ever seen it. It turned their lane into a narrow tunnel of gray, swallowing up houses just a few doors down. The frost had painted the grass in silver, and every breath puffed out in small clouds. Sophie slipped her mittened hand into her mother's and tugged gently, her eyes darting toward the curve of the road. "Do you think we'll see him?" she whispered. Her mother gave a small smile, brushing a wisp of hair from Sophie's cheek. "Maybe. Keep your eyes open." Neither of them knew, as they stepped into that muffled, gray morning, that the answer to her question was waiting just ahead, and that it would lead to a story their small town would remember for years. The fog seemed to breathe that morning, curling and shifting with every faint stir of wind, wrapping the little road in ghostly shapes. Sophie's boots crunched softly on the gravel as she walked beside her mother, her school bag swinging lightly with each step. She had been scanning the mist since they'd left the house, eyes sharp, hoping for a glimpse of the mysterious German shepherd she had heard so much about. And then, just past the bend where the hedgerows broke and the lane opened toward the fields, she saw him. He emerged not with the suddenness of a surprise, but as though the fog itself was parting to reveal him. A large, steady figure, fur mottled in shades of black and tan, standing perfectly still in the pale light. The mist coiled gently around his legs, and his breath came in slow, visible puffs that drifted into the morning air. His eyes, deep amber, almost gold, locked on Sophie from the moment he appeared, as if he had been waiting. Sophie slowed her steps, her mittened hand tightening in her mother's. The dog didn't move forward, but he didn't retreat either. He simply stood, watching them with an expression she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, nor was it aggression. It was something else. Something that made her chest feel warm and curious all at once. Her mother's voice was low. "That's him." She didn't say his name, because they didn't know it, but Sophie knew exactly who she meant. Up close, the shepherd didn't look like a stray. His coat was thick and well-kept, his body strong. He was clearly healthy, which made his solitary presence all the more mysterious. Her mother's grip on her hand didn't loosen, though, and Sophie could sense the edge of caution in it. For a long moment, nothing moved except the fog. Sophie could hear her own heartbeat, the distant crow of a rooster somewhere far across the fields, and the faint whisper of the wind through the brittle grass. Then, without a sound, the dog turned his head slightly, just enough to glance toward the open stretch of road behind him. He looked back at Sophie once more, and then, with quiet, deliberate steps, melted back into the mist until there was nothing but shifting gray where he had stood. That image stayed with her all day. At school, while her teacher explained subtraction, Sophie's pencil hovered above her notebook, her mind tracing the shape of those golden eyes. She replayed the stillness of his body, the way he had neither come closer nor run away, as though the space between them had been some kind of unspoken agreement. The next morning, Sophie was ready. Before they left for the bus stop, she slipped a small piece of bread into her pocket, left over from breakfast. Her mother noticed but didn't comment, only raising an eyebrow as Sophie zipped up her coat. "For the dog," Sophie said matter-of-factly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The fog was lighter that day, but still clung in low swirls across the fields. And there he was again, appearing almost exactly where he had the day before. This time, Sophie stepped forward a little, her heart quickening. The shepherd's ears pricked slightly, and his gaze dropped to the hand she was pulling from her pocket. "I brought you something," she said softly, though she knew he probably couldn't hear her clearly. She held out the bread in her mitten, palm up. The dog didn't come closer, not right away. Instead, he took one slow step backward, then another, his eyes never leaving hers. He wasn't turning away, he was inviting her. Every few steps, he paused, glancing over his shoulder as if checking whether she was following. Sophie took a small step forward, then another, the bread still in her hand. The damp air felt cooler here, and the mist seemed thicker, as though she were crossing into a quieter, hidden part of the morning. She felt an odd pull in her chest, not fear, but the kind of curiosity that made her want to see what lay beyond the fog. Just then, her mother's voice cut through the silence, firm but not sharp. "Sophie, come back." She froze, caught between her mother's call and the shepherd's watchful eyes. The dog had stopped moving, standing half-shrouded in the mist a short distance ahead. For a moment, Sophie thought he might come forward after all. Instead, he blinked once, slowly, almost like a nod, and then turned, vanishing once more into the fog, leaving only the faintest disturbance in the air where he had been. Sophie let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding and turned reluctantly back toward her mother. Her mittens still held the bread, now slightly damp from the fog. As they walked toward the bus stop, she couldn't help glancing over her shoulder, hoping to see even the tip of his tail. That night, as she lay in bed, the memory of his gaze lingered in her mind. Where had he wanted her to go? Why did it feel like he was trying to show her something? Sophie pulled the blanket closer, her eyes drifting shut, and somewhere between waking and dreaming, she imagined walking with him through the fog toward a place she couldn't yet see. She didn't know it yet, but the answer to those questions would come soon, and it would change the way she thought about the quiet mornings, the fog, and the shepherd forever. The fog had become part of Sophie's mornings now. It curled around fence posts and draped over the fields like a heavy blanket, softening every shape into something ghost-like. And always, without fail, he was there. The German shepherd stood in the same spot on the country road, as though some invisible clock had told him exactly when to appear. Each day played out the same: the stillness, the watchful eyes, the slow turn of his head toward the unseen stretch beyond. But lately, there had been something else. He would walk a few paces away, pause, and look back at her, waiting. Sophie's feet always itched to follow, but her mother's firm hand kept her grounded. Still, she could feel the question pressing harder inside her. Where was he trying to take her? By the fourth morning, Sophie couldn't hold it in any longer. "Mom," she whispered as they stood on the frosty gravel, watching him through the silver haze. "Please, just once. Let's see where he goes." Her mother hesitated, glancing at the misty road ahead. There was an unspoken wariness about following strange dogs into fog-covered paths. But the shepherd wasn't strange anymore, not to Sophie. His presence had taken on a quiet familiarity, almost like a morning greeting. And though her mother tried to hide it, Sophie had caught her watching him too, her gaze filled with the same curiosity. That morning, the cold bit sharper, the air tasting of frost and damp earth. Her mother pulled her wool hat lower over her ears and zipped Sophie's coat right up to her chin. "Stay close," she said, "and if I tell you to stop, you stop." Sophie nodded, her heart already racing. The shepherd seemed to sense the change instantly. When they stepped toward him instead of heading for the bus stop, his ears twitched, and he turned without hesitation, slipping deeper into the gray curtain ahead. Sophie and her mother followed. The gravel road narrowed into a dirt path lined with tall, bare trees. The fog clung thicker here, swirling in ghostly eddies around their boots. The sound of their footsteps was muffled, as though the mist itself was swallowing every noise. Sophie could see the shepherd's broad frame just ahead, sometimes crisp in view, sometimes only a shadow moving in the whiteness. Every so often, he'd stop, glance over his shoulder to make sure they were still coming, then move forward again. They walked for what felt like forever, though Sophie knew it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. The world beyond the fog had disappeared completely. It was just them, the quiet path, and the steady guide of the dog's dark silhouette. The air grew cooler as they went, carrying a faint scent of damp wood and something else. Sophie wrinkled her nose. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was different, the faintest hint of smoke as if from a far-off fire. Finally, the shepherd slowed, his tail swaying gently. The fog parted just enough for Sophie to see the shape of a building ahead, small, hunched, and worn by time. An old wooden cabin sat tucked between the trees, its roof sagging slightly, the once red paint faded into a dull rust. Moss clung to the sides, and the windows were clouded with years of dust and moisture. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen this place before. But it wasn't the cabin's age or mystery that made her shiver. It was the thin, wavering column of smoke curling up from a crooked chimney. Her mother's grip on her hand tightened. "Someone's here." The shepherd stopped in front of the cabin door, lowering himself to sit in the frost-strewn grass. His ears swiveled toward the building, and he gave a low, quiet whine. Sophie could feel her own heartbeat in her ears. The fog muffled every sound except the faint crackle of firewood and something else. A soft, dry cough drifted from inside, barely audible through the door. It was a frail sound, not the kind that came from someone healthy. Her mother crouched beside her, whispering, "Stay here a moment." But Sophie's eyes were fixed on the dog, who now stood again, his gaze locked on the weathered wooden door as though willing it to open. Another cough came, followed by the slow shadow of movement through one of the fogged windows. A thin silhouette passed by, slow and slightly hunched. The shepherd's tail gave the faintest wag, not joyful but expectant. Sophie's skin prickled. Whoever was inside, the dog knew them. And judging by the way he had led them here so deliberately, they were meant to see this. Her mother straightened slowly, eyes scanning the cabin, her breath making small clouds in the air. She didn't say it aloud, but Sophie could sense it, the same unspoken understanding between them that had been there the first morning they saw him. This is more than just a dog wandering in the fog. The wooden door creaked faintly from the wind, though it didn't open. The shepherd stayed rooted in place, his body still, his eyes moving between Sophie, her mother, and the faint shifting shadows inside the cabin. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if sensing they had seen enough for today, the shepherd took a single step back toward the path. His gaze lingered a moment longer on Sophie, and then he turned, disappearing once again into the mist. Sophie stood there in the cold, staring at the crooked cabin with its thin ribbon of smoke. The cough still echoed faintly in her ears, and her mind whirled with questions. But she knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow, when the fog returned, she would follow him again. The next morning, Sophie and her mother didn't wait for the bus stop. They left early, their boots crunching softly over the frost as the fog wrapped around them once more. Just as Sophie knew he would be, the German shepherd was there, standing still in the mist, his amber eyes fixed on her. When they stepped toward him, his ears twitched, and without hesitation, he turned and began walking. The path was the same as before, narrow, damp with dew, the fog clinging so thick that it swallowed the trees whole. But today, there was a quiet determination in Sophie's steps. She felt, deep in her small chest, that the answers she'd been searching for were finally within reach. When they reached the clearing, the cabin looked just as it had the day before, leaning slightly, cloaked in moss and memories. The thin thread of smoke trailed lazily from the chimney, and somewhere inside, that faint, weary cough echoed again. The dog sat by the door, looking at Sophie, then at her mother, and finally at the weathered wooden planks as if urging them forward. Sophie's mother hesitated only a moment before stepping up to the porch and knocking. The sound was hollow against the old wood, carrying into the foggy stillness. There was a pause, long enough for Sophie to hear the faint creak of footsteps within. The door opened slowly, revealing an elderly man framed in the dim light from inside. His hair was silver and unkempt, his face lined not just with age, but with the kind of weariness that comes from years of solitude. Surprise flickered in his eyes, but there was no alarm. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice rough as though unused to speaking much. Before Sophie or her mother could answer, the shepherd moved. He padded quickly to the man's side, pressing his body protectively against his leg. The man's hand dropped instinctively to the dog's head, his fingers brushing over the familiar fur. Sophie's mother offered a gentle smile. "We've seen your dog in the mornings. He's led us here twice now." The man's gaze softened, and he glanced down at the shepherd. "So you followed him?" Sophie nodded before her mother could speak. He wanted us too, she said with quiet certainty. The man stepped back slightly, gesturing for them to come in. The cabin was small but warm, with the scent of wood smoke hanging in the air. A kettle sat on a cast-iron stove, steam curling from its spout. Everything inside looked carefully kept, though there was a sense of fading, the kind that comes when hands have grown too tired to keep up with life's little demands. The shepherd settled by the man's chair, still watching Sophie and her mother with alert eyes. "His name is Rex," the man said after a moment. "He belonged to my wife." His voice caught slightly and he cleared his throat. She passed away 2 winters ago. Since then, it's just been the two of us." Sophie's mother glanced at the kettle, the neat stack of firewood by the hearth, and the way the man's shoulders sagged slightly as he sat down. "You live here alone?" she asked gently. He nodded. "Mostly. Some neighbors check in when they can. But lately," he gave a small shrug as if the words were too heavy. "My health isn't what it was. The walks to town are harder, the mornings colder." Sophie's eyes moved from the man to Rex, who was resting his head on the man's knee but watching her intently. Something clicked in her mind, the stillness in the fog, the way Rex had waited each morning, looking right at her. The man must have seen the understanding dawn on her face, because he gave a faint smile. "I think he's been trying to find help. He started going out at dawn a few weeks ago. Always gone for an hour or so. I suppose he was searching for someone who might notice." Sophie felt a lump rise in her throat. "He chose me," she whispered. Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. Rex lifted his head, his ears perking slightly at Sophie's voice. He stood, walked over to her, and sat down just close enough for her to reach out. Tentatively, she laid her small hand on his fur. It was warm, thick, and somehow carried the scent of smoke and winter air. Rex didn't move away. The man's smile faded a little as he looked at them. "I don't know how much longer I can keep up with him. He's strong, needs more than I can give these days. I worry," his voice trailed off, and for a moment, the only sound was the quiet crackle of the stove. "I worry what will happen to him when I can't." Sophie's heart squeezed. She couldn't imagine the foggy mornings without seeing him there, waiting. And now that she knew why he'd been standing so still in that mist, watching, hoping, she couldn't bear the thought of him being alone again. Her mother met the man's eyes, and though no one said it yet, Sophie could sense that something important was about to change. Sophie's mother looked at the man, then at Rex, and then back again. The silence in the cabin felt heavy, but not uncomfortable, more like the pause before a choice that would change everything. She took a slow breath. "What if," she began, her voice gentle, "Rex came to live with us? Just down the road. You could visit any time you wanted." The old man blinked, clearly surprised, and looked down at Rex, who was still sitting close to Sophie, his ears twitching at the sound of her mother's words. You'd really take him in?" Sophie nodded eagerly, the thought spilling out before she could stop it. "He wouldn't be alone anymore. And I promise I'll take care of him. I'll play with him and give him food and brush his fur." Her voice was earnest, her small hands clasped tightly together, as if holding on to the hope she'd just spoken aloud. The man's eyes softened, a mixture of relief and sadness glistening there. "I've been worried about what would happen to him," he admitted. "If you can give him the life he deserves, then yes. I'd like that. But only if I can come by sometimes to see my boy." "You can come every week." Sophie beamed, as though she'd just been handed the most precious gift in the world. The transition happened quickly. That very afternoon, Sophie and her mother returned with a warm blanket, a leash, and a small basket of food. Rex trotted beside them willingly, casting a few glances back toward the cabin, but never pulling away. It was as though he understood this was the beginning of something new. His first night in their home was quiet. Sophie lay on the living room floor, watching him explore, nose twitching as he inspected every corner, tail moving slowly, cautiously. When he finally curled up beside the couch, Sophie's heart felt like it might burst. She reached over, resting her hand gently on his back, and he let out a deep, contented sigh. Over the next few days, Rex began to change. The solemn stillness he'd carried in the fog gave way to moments of playfulness. He followed Sophie from room to room, his nails clicking softly on the wooden floor. In the backyard, he discovered the joy of chasing a ball again, something that made Sophie laugh so hard she nearly fell over. Meanwhile, the community stepped in for the elderly man. Neighbors brought warm meals, chopped wood for his stove, and helped repair the loose shutters on his cabin. Word of Rex's story had spread, and it seemed everyone wanted to play a part in making sure both man and dog were cared for. Every few days, Sophie and her mother would visit the cabin, Rex trotting happily ahead. The moment the man opened the door, Rex's tail would wag wildly, and he'd nudge his head against the man's hand, greeting him with a familiar love that never faded. Those visits became a ritual, one that kept the bond between the three of them strong. One evening, after a long day of playing in the yard, Sophie sat cross-legged in the living room. Rex lay sprawled at her feet, his head resting on her toes. His eyes were half closed, his breathing deep and slow, utterly at peace. The fog outside rolled in again, just as thick as the morning they'd first met. But this time, Rex wasn't out there, standing alone in the cold. He was home, warm, safe, and surrounded by people who loved him. And Sophie knew, without needing to say it, that neither of them would ever forget the morning in the fog that had brought them together. The seasons had turned. The cold, heavy fog of that first meeting was long gone, replaced by the gentle glow of a spring morning. The same country road stretched ahead, but now it was lined with blossoming trees and patches of wildflowers swaying in the breeze. Sophie, now a little taller and just as bright-eyed, walked with one hand loosely holding the leash of her best friend. Rex trotted beside her, his ears perked, his tail swaying with a calm happiness that came from knowing he was right where he belonged. They passed the exact spot where they had first seen each other months ago, Sophie clutching her mother's hand, Rex standing silent and still in the thick fog, eyes full of longing. She slowed for a moment, glancing at the space as if she could still see that version of him, waiting. But this morning, there was no fog, no uncertainty. Only the warmth of the sun on their faces and the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. Rex looked up at her, and she reached down to ruffle the fur behind his ears. His gaze was no longer searching. It was steady, full of trust, and full of love. In the distance, a neighbor waved and Sophie waved back. The story of how Rex had come into their lives had spread far beyond the town. Some people stopped her mother in the market just to ask how that fog dog was doing. Others shared their own stories. A stray cat they'd taken in, a bird they'd rescued, a friend they'd helped in hard times. The truth was, Rex's journey had changed more than just Sophie's family. It had reminded people that even in the quietest corners of the world, small acts of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives they'd never expected to reach. They turned the corner toward the park. Rex bounded ahead a few steps, nose twitching at the smell of fresh grass. Sophie laughed and jogged to catch up, her hair catching the sunlight. She thought about the man in the cabin, how he still smiled every time they brought Rex to visit, how he always said, "You've given him back his joy." As they walked into the open green space, a gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of the blossoms overhead. Sophie stopped for a moment, holding Rex's leash loosely as she took in the view. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that morning in the fog had been no accident. The narrator's voice came softly, almost like a thought floating in the air. Sometimes, the path through the fog leads us exactly where we're meant to be. And sometimes, the friend waiting at the end isn't the one we expect, but the one we need most. The image lingered on Sophie and Rex walking side by side under the canopy of blossoms, their shadows stretching ahead of them. The music swelled, tender and full of hope. Then, as the screen began to fade to white, a final line appeared. Do you have a story of an unexpected friendship or rescue? Share it with us. Someone out there might need to hear it today. Soft piano notes played until the last frame disappeared. The story might be over, but the impact will stay. Thanks for watching and being part of this experience. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales that will leave you thinking long after the credits roll.